Could you just introduce yourself to our podcast audience?
Hi, I'm Professor Sarah Rankin. I'm a professor at Imperial College in the Faculty of Medicine. I have a research group researching in the area of regenerative pharmacology, and I do a lot of other activities at Imperial. So, for example, teaching master's students and having PhD students, and also involved in a lot of equality diversity activities.
You said you did equality and diversity, so you do a lot of stuff around neurodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my whole career I've been doing different types of EDI activity because somebody my age, when I came into university, there were no female professors, for example, in the department that I worked in at Imperial. Now there are 65% of the professors in our department are female, and that has taken a lot of work by all the women in the department, I would say, sort of concerted effort of many women. And that's sort of one area that I have been very involved in over my whole career. More in the last sort of 12, 15 years, I've been very much involved in increasing diversity in terms of the sort of ethnic diversity, and particularly increasing number of Black students, that Black UK students particularly, because we have low numbers of students of Black heritage at Imperial. And then the other thing, as you say, has been recent years, has been looking at the area of neurodiversity.
So you're neurodiverse yourself.
Yeah, although the correct term would be neurodivergent, because neurodiverse refers to sort of a population like biodiverse. So although I don't like the term neurodivergent, I have to say, but I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic. So that's a sort of formal diagnosis that I didn't get until I was in my late 40s. So when I was at school, I did not have that diagnosis. I didn't have any, accommodations, extra time exams, anything like that.
How do you feel that your neurodiversity kind of influenced you as you were growing up? How did you feel you dealt with educational settings?
Most people from my generation, we never had a formal diagnosis. It wasn't a thing. We were just told that you're slow or you're stupid or you're clumsy, very often lazy, because what teachers would see in the classroom is people that were very engaged and clearly sort of understood things, but then it didn't translate onto paper. And so the fact that maybe, if we were asked to write an essay, it wasn't the best essay, but we could verbally describe things. And so it was the sort of disconnect between what we produced and maybe how we performed in exams compared with how we could perform if we were being asked questions in the classroom.
But you still kind of went on to do further study, though.
Yeah, I think one really important thing for me, which was sort of an accident, was I discovered that I could remember things very well if I drew them, rather than, I know when we, particularly at school, we were taught to just write stuff out of a textbook and copy a textbook out, and that was a way of learning. I didn't learn anything if I did that. I had to develop my own ways, my own sort of strategies of how to learn things. One that worked really well for me was to draw things. Even if it was science, I had to draw it out. I had to make it into a story. I had to use a lot of colour. And that way I could really sort of, it helped me engage with the content. It helped me work out how it fitted together, because quite often I'd try and fit a lot of things on a single piece of A4 and sort of show relationships between them. Now I realise that sort of interest in how things sort of fit together is part of my strengths, is always seeing the interconnectedness of different topics, even sort of disparate things.
I have I'm neurodivergent as well, and I find I can't rote learn. I have to kind of sort of write it out and show that there's sort of logical steps to actually be able to remember anything, basically.
Yeah, And I think that is also interesting in the context of learning, and also in the context of all the work that I do and all my research. Very often when you're doing research, you're focusing on one very specific problem. And quite often when you're being taught something, you're being taught sort of one, element of things. If somebody just presents the detail of something very specific, it doesn't make sense to me without the bigger picture. So I always need the bigger picture. I always need to contextualize things. And if I can't contextualize them, I can't understand them. But also, like you're saying, they don't sort of seem to slot into my brain. Once somewhere it has got somewhere specific to go, I know it will sort of stay in there and stay in there forever. But also, I know where I can find it again because it sort of, that it makes sense. I, could not learn random facts at all.
I think to some extent, actually, it's an advantage because I really understand a subject. I can't
Yeah,
memorize a subject, so I have to really kind of know the logic behind what's going on, if that makes sense.
yeah. And I think that was another thing that I realised sort of now, obviously at this point in my career, but I realised when I was in school, there were things that didn't make sense. And that was because we were taught, for example, science in a very black and white way about the facts. And clearly, once you are doing research, you realise that there are a lot of things that aren't black and white, that are grey, and that, that there's always exceptions to the rule, and there's always this and there's always that. So things are not as straightforward, and therefore they're a lot more interesting. But sometimes when you are presented it in a way at school, if you're somebody that is really thinking about it in depth, it doesn't make sense because you're saying, well, that can't be right because in this situation or that situation, and it doesn't make sense to you, and therefore it's sort of like, okay, is this me just being stupid and not understanding the thing correctly? And it's not until you get more advanced in your studies that you realise what I was told before is sort of essentially not the whole story.
How do you feel that being neurodiverse has sort of helped in your research career?
I think once, I mean, obviously, most of my research career, I didn't realise I was neurodiverse. So, but I think definitely now that I understand what my sort of strengths and weaknesses are, I think I have managed to play to my strengths in that a big part of, if you're doing scientific research, a big part is innovation and being creative and having ideas. And that is something, as somebody that is dyslexic, dyspraxic, I have a lot of ideas. I'm very creative. And so that for me has always given me a sort of edge. I'm also, I don't mind taking risks, so I don't mind. I find it quite exciting to go and research something that everybody else says is rubbish or of no interest, and so that sort of challenge I like as well. And I don't really mind. I think one thing maybe about being a dyslexic woman in science is I don't really mind if I fail, because I guess from a very early age you've been told you're failing, so you sort of used to that sort of idea. So it's always nice when you are successful. You don't have that expectation that you will be successful. You just try things and hope for the best, and tend to always to do things that interest me. And I think the other thing that I've done, which, yeah, I've always done things a bit less conventionally, say, than my colleagues. I've been very interested in art and societal engagement, and I've done that throughout my career. And I think that has really helped with my research. But it's quite interesting now that, there are younger people saying, actually, I don't want to just be a scientist. I'm interested in art as well, and I want to do this. And actually, how science impacts society is really important, and actually how we communicate science to society. And we saw in COVID, but we know with the climate change, all these things, we can't really just be in this little bubble of just being scientists. And I think it's easy, if you want to be a researcher. I think there are a lot of researchers that are very insular, I think, and they're amazing researchers, but then they don't have that bigger picture. I'm always looking at that bigger picture and looking for the next opportunities, and yeah, I find that exciting. So, and I'm always looking for other people to work with, just because, again, it brings something different to your science. So, and it makes it more complicated when you start working with physicists and engineers and things, and it's not always successful, but it makes it interesting. And I think that's, part of what I'm supposed to be doing.
And do you think sort of having a neurodivergent brain makes you, if you're sort of able to sort of see things visually, do you think that makes you more able to sort of communicate it, if that makes sense? Because you kind of processed it in a different way.
I don't think it's a case of I communicate better than somebody else. I think I can communicate in a different way. I prefer to communicate in a different way, and I will probably, and what I realised, for example, I did a whole project looking at how to make teaching more inclusive for neurodivergent people. And when I researched into that, a lot of the things are things that I would do anyway, because I'm neurodivergent. I have a lot of visuals. I don't have very much words on my slides. I tend to do activities in the classroom. There's so many little things that, for me, that is the natural way of being. So I guess if you are a dyslexic student, then having somebody like me teaching you is going to be an advantage, maybe. But I think everybody has different preferences, and some people love text. They love reading huge amounts and can do that very quickly. So that's their preferred medium. For me, I think it's important that we just respect that different people have different ways that they want to communicate, that they want to consume information.
You said you were diagnosed late. I'm just wondering, like, how you came to be diagnosed, and kind of did you sort of see yourself differently after the diagnosis?
I got my diagnosis, as a lot of late diagnosed people, they get their diagnosis when they have a child that has a diagnosis, and you're talking to an educational psychologist that's saying, that this child does X, Y, and Z, and you think, well, that's what I do. And so, and this is, we know that these different sort of conditions, whatever you want to call them, are genetic. And so that a lot of people find out because they're children, and they start looking at their children. I think it was what was a bit of a revelation, because, I had a very limited understanding of what dyslexia was. I didn't even know the word dyspraxia. So it was all new to me, but it did explain a lot of how I was. And what was surprising to me was, okay, this is not just about how I perform in a classroom, in an exam or whatever. This is affecting my whole life, because things like time management, things like being organised, these are things that impact, your ability to do any sort of job, and also live any life. So it's good. It's sort of, in some respects, it's good to know, okay, why that is, or why you find those things more challenging. And it's also great when you meet other people that are neurodivergent. I think that has been one of the real positives for all the work that I have done around neurodiversity, is that I have met people, lots of other professionals, doing all different sorts of jobs successfully, but we can get together and discuss what our challenges are, and we can also support each other in that, make suggestions of things, of how we can make things easier, and looking at that for our children, our students, etc., etc.
As well as doing the research at Imperial, you also do You've also written about neurodiversity in the workplace and about the, I suppose, advantages it can bring and about getting more neurodiverse people, especially into academia.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm kind of curious about is how do your colleagues view
I think the thing is, I've been at Imperial almost 30 years. They know that I'm different. They know that I always sort of, yeah, so they know I'm different. I guess they're used to that. I've done projects in the past, lots of things where they just thought, what is she doing? Like I did science pop-up shops where we, took over a shop and the whole institute, I got involved in running these pop-up shops over 2 weeks, and we did it twice, and it was amazing, and it worked, and everybody was really surprised about how successful it was. So again, it's things like that. They're used to me doing things that aren't the norm. But with the neurodiversity thing, I get a lot of people, I think the majority just I don't know. They're just so. I think there's two types of people. There are the people that are probably, I would say, there are some. For example, there are male professors that are autistic that don't realise that they're autistic, and so that's totally disengaged in it. They don't see that it's of relevance to anything, which is quite interesting. And essentially, I think one of the big problems is role modelling, because you need to have role models. And was the whole thing. As I started at the beginning, I was saying about women in science. And the big thing there was having role models. We need more role models. And now we've got masses of female scientists, engineers, etc. But we really don't have, although there are some incredible neurodivergent, incredibly famous scientists like Stephen Hawkins or Steve Jobs, or there's some people that you can pull out, the Wright brothers or somebody like that were clearly neurodivergent. It's harder to find that today in academia. So it's harder to find those role models in academia. The people, they are there, and quite a lot of people will tell me that they're neurodivergent, but they don't want it to be known generally. And that shows a lack of psychological safety. And that's because a lot of people, especially in the older generations, are still, some of them think it's a made up thing. Most of them think it's, just so that people can get extra time in their exams. They don't understand how it works, how that translates to the real world. There's a lack of interest in it, a lack of engagement, a lack of understanding, and just a lack of willingness to understand. And that's what I find in academia. In contrast, when I go into industry, so I've been working in biotech industry, in pharma industry, particularly, for example, with AstraZeneca, which we know, huge pharma. I mean, I've had really incredible response from all the employees, from all different levels up to leadership levels. They set up after I'd visited them, they set up a network. They now have over 3,000 people in their network. So I know there's neurodivergent scientists. I know that there's more in businesses than there are in academia. And I think that's an interesting thing, because are people leaving academia because actually they don't fit? And I think most people would not understand that, because they think of, if you think of stereotypes in terms of scientists, you think of somebody like Einstein, and you think, the idea used to be about a very eccentric professor. And if we think about some of those eccentric professors, like somebody like Cavendish, he was clearly very eccentric, but his eccentricity was actually manifested because of his autism. But he was incredibly brilliant. Now, would somebody like him survive in an academic environment today? there's a lot of politics involved in academia now, and in getting promoted. There's a lot of, you can't really have that real sort of just eccentric personality now and be brilliant as an academic. You know, there's lots of things that you have to be able to do. So I think for that reason, it's not as accommodating as maybe it was in the past. And it's interesting with the business is because the businesses are, they're much more looking at this from a business standpoint, because they're saying, okay, these are the people that could have really innovative ideas. They're the people who could think outside the box. So if we're having a team of people, we want to ensure that we have cognitive diversity in that team. So it's got some people that think in different ways, because that is likely to bring the best results. And so they are thinking in a much more sort of pragmatic business way to have the benefits that neurodivergent people can bring to their organisations. So it's just interesting. And then the other group of people that I've been talking to recently are entrepreneurs and founders and people that are setting up new businesses in bioindustry, biotech. And there, the recent report shows you have a very high percentage of neurodivergent people. It's at least 11%. And for CEOs, the CEOs of those companies, it's at least 13%. So that's very high compared with academia, which means, again, it suggests people are finding a different, you know, that they are more suited maybe in different work environments. And so that's something that I'm really interested in, that actually I tend to find neurodivergent people not so much in the academic world, but outside of the academic world. So working in different areas of science. So it might be in policy, it might be in communications, because they're great communicators, storytellers, or, as I say, as entrepreneurs. So I think that is not necessarily a bad thing. Makes me think, why did I remain an academic? But that's what I would advise any student now that comes to me that's neurodivergent. I would say, well, okay, think about your options. You know, don't feel like academia is the only, you know, or the best way to continue your career. There are other options.
So one other kind of point from the paper that I read was you write about other forms of assessment, like was it podcasting and stuff like this?
Yeah.
But it's also probably a better way in some respects to get sort of scientific points across rather than necessarily just writing papers. It's potentially more open to sort of public consumption, as it were.
Yeah, and I guess it really depends who you are trying to communicate with, doesn't it? Who's your audience? So, and the reality is, if you want to change policy with your research, then you've got to communicate with different people in a different way, because a lot of the policymakers are not scientists and they can't read graphs in the same way and data. I mean, I think that's one thing that we probably forget as scientists, that we just get so used to looking at data and interpreting data. So I do think, yes, the data visualization, you know, those sort of skills, being able to talk. And I think this is where it's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, I've always worked with artists and other people, and also done a lot of outreach work, and that has given me the ability to talk at multiple levels about my science, depending, you know, on the audience. And I think that's a really important skill, because we need, as I was saying, we need to be able to communicate our science to wider society if we really want it to have the impact that we imagine.
Do you have anything else you kind of want to cover that's not been covered?
You mentioned the assessments, and this is where we're moving towards more inclusive assessments. And this would be giving people, for example, the option, like, do you want to write a 2,000 word narrative, or do you want to put that in a infographic with a shorter executive summary, because both of those things are valid. Both of those things require different skill sets. And actually, you know, I think it's good to give people the option to start exploring different ways as well, and also to find what sort of works best for them.